Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. It can seem like we live in a world that celebrates extroverted qualities, and this can seem more so when you think about leadership. Traditional leadership role models tend to be associated with extroverted qualities. They're charismatic, assertive, they're good networkers, they're great at public speaking. So the journey for introverted people in leadership can be more challenging as there's an unfavourable bias towards introversion in the workplace. Layer in being a woman, and there are some unique challenges for introverted women in leadership roles, which can hold us back from fulfilling our potential. That's why I'm delighted to be joined by today's guest, Carol Stewart. Carol is an executive coach and leadership coach. She's a speaker, trainer, podcast host, and author. She's the founder of Unbounding Solutions and author of Quietly Visible, Leading with Influence and Impact as an Introverted Woman. She coaches women to lead with confidence, influence and impact, with a specialism in introverted women who are senior leaders. Carol was recognised as one of Britain's top 50 business advisors by Enterprise Nation, a rising star champion for her work with women leaders by the We Are the City, and named as a LinkedIn Top Voice UK 5 times, including 2022 Top Voice for Gender Equality. In 2023, she was added to the Northern Power Women Power List, which recognises trailblazers who challenge the norm and shift the dial towards a more equitable world for women in work. And she's listed as a top 32 business influencer by Business Leader magazine and was the winner of an Inspirational Woman Award for the 18th Wise Women Awards. So wow, we have got an amazing woman with us. Carol is also a regular columnist for the Sheffield Telegraph and hosts the Quietly Visible podcast. And she gives the time to causes that support the next generation, gender and racial equality and social inclusion. So I am delighted to be able to welcome Carol to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show. In this episode, Carol and I explore the difficulties introverted women encounter in areas such as communication, networking, and external perceptions. Carol sheds light on the misconceptions and stereotypes surrounding introversion, and she also offers guidance and tips on how to overcome them. I can't wait for you to dive into this conversation with Carol. So come join us as we explore how, as introverted women, we can build our confidence and assert our leadership capabilities. And by the way, if you're actually an extrovert, you will still get lots from this episode because we explore how we interact and support introverted people in our lives and in our work. So welcome, Carol. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Hi, Nikki. It's a pleasure to be here.
So obviously you're here to talk to us about kind of introverted women. And I first came across your work actually on a webinar that you were talking about proximity bias.
Oh, yes.
And that's how I connected with you, and then found out about your book, Quietly Visible, Leading with Influence and Impact as an Introverted Woman. Can you share a bit of the journey that you've been on and the work that you do and kind of what motivated you to write the book and do the work that you do in the world?
Right. Okay. So I'm introverted, and I'm introvert and proud, but I haven't always been. Growing up as a child, I was always quiet and I lacked confidence. And I used to, as I sort of got older and sort of worked on my self-development, I recognised that I didn't actually lack confidence. It was because I was quiet, and I was mistaking that for a lack of confidence because of the misconceptions that exist about introversion. As a leader, before I started my coaching business in an organisation, I was very aware that back then I didn't really fully understand the differences between introversion and extroversion. But I was aware that I was quieter, and I would often be told, "Oh, you should speak up more in meetings, and you should talk more about what your group is doing," that sort of thing. It was not probably a couple of years before I left employment, and as an area leadership team, we did the Myers-Briggs test. And I remember adding the scores and coming out ISTJ and re-adding them because I didn't want to identify with the I because of the misconceptions that you heard about introversion. But no matter how I tried to re-add those scores, it still came out ISTJ. And then they did this thing after everybody had scored themselves where you had to go into a corner of the room depending on what you came out as. And I just thought that was a horrible experience. And then it was once I left employment, I was doing a master's in coaching psychology because I'd left with the intention of starting my coaching business. I was doing a master's in coaching psychology, and I started to, one of the things that we looked at was the work of Carl Jung. And that's when I got a better understanding of introversion. And it's like I really started to understand myself and really see that the misconceptions that exist. Anyway, fast forward a few years, and I was reflecting on the clients that I'd worked with, and I recognised that a lot of them were introverted as well. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I started writing articles about the challenges introverted women leaders face. And I got bombarded with messages from women, from men all over the world sharing their experiences with me. And it was sort of during this period as well that once when I was out networking and I was speaking to a woman and I told her that I was introverted, and she said to me, "Oh, you don't look like an introvert." And I thought, well, what is an introvert supposed to look like? And that was really sort of piqued my interest. And I put a call out on social media and I asked the question, when you think of the word introvert, what comes to mind? And I got responses such as shy, lacking confidence, aloof, social misfit, all negative terms, which could also be associated with extroverts as well. And that just highlighted to me the extent to which there was an unfavourable bias towards introversion in the workplace, in society, particularly here in the UK, in the US, and some other countries as well. And so that's what led to me when I realised the extent of the issue and how many introverted women leaders had challenges because of misconceptions. And oftentimes what happens is because of these misconceptions, it fed into the way that they saw themselves. And so that's what led to the book.
Oh, I love that. And thank you for sharing that journey. I'm just really conscious because we can use terms that we assume other people are familiar with. And I think it might be worth us just putting that baseline in place for people, because I'm sure most people listening will have heard of introversion, extroversion. They may not have they may have been falling into those misconceptions. Could you explain what you mean when you talk about introversion and extroversion? So at least we're all kind of coming at it from the same place.
Yeah. So introversion and extroversion, they are personality traits, and they exist along a continuum, and we all have a preference as to where we fit along that continuum. So some of us veer towards introversion, some veer towards extroversion, some are what it's called ambivert, which is I call sort of the best of both worlds because they're both introverted and extroverted. And it's all about how we interact and engage with the world. So people who are introverted have a preference for environments that are not overly stimulating. So being in environments where there's a lot of external activity going on, a lot of social activity can be overly stimulating. And as a result of that, it can make us feel drained. And so we like to go inwards to recharge. So maybe being in a quiet space or being on our own or being with a smaller group of people in order to recharge and re-energize. Whereas people who are extroverted, they tend to thrive in environments where there's that external activities going on. So being around people, being in social environments, they tend to thrive being in those environments. And there's lots of ways in which it shows up in our behaviors. So people who are introverted have a preference for thinking and processing information and then speaking, whereas people who are extroverted, they tend to have a preference for speaking and whilst they're about processing the information and speaking and processing the information whilst they're speaking. And oftentimes that can be misconstrued that because somebody's talking, that they are more confident than the person that isn't talking. But it doesn't necessarily mean so. It could be that the person who is extroverted and thinking out loud, so to speak, is just talking their thoughts through and then they get to their point. And different environments and different situations will determine how we act and behave. So, I like to go networking. I like to go to social events and activities. But if I'm in that sort of environment for too long, I will come away feeling quite drained. Whereas someone who's extroverted, that might just really energize them. So being in that sort of environment.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that, because I think that's really important, because they're terms that we hear. And I think, as you say, it's about recognizing their personality traits. It's not one better than the other, even if our kind of culturally they might be perceived that way. It's kind of, it's just how we're born and how we interact with the world. And before we hit record, I was sharing with you about what we might believe that we are. So when I was younger, I thought I was an extrovert, and I would have very clearly said I was an extrovert. But the older I've got, the more I've acknowledged and honored my introversion tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
And, just anybody listening, just to reflect on that about, we might have learned to behave in a particular way, but actually, is that your natural preference, and what might that mean? So in your book, you talk about the unique challenges that actually introverted women face in leadership roles. Could you share a bit about those challenges and what impact you think they might have on somebody's career progression?
So because of a lot of the misconceptions, it can shape how people see people who are introverted. So some of the challenges are, so you've got that set of challenges because people, we live in what Susan Cain, who wrote the book, Quiet, the Power of Introverts in the World That Can't Stop Talking, what she calls the extrovert ideal. And that's an omnipresent belief that the ideal self is alpha, gregarious, and comfortable being in the spotlight. And historically, that is what has been associated with being a good leader.
Yeah.
And so and it's often the case that he or she who shouts the loudest is the one that gets heard, gets the recognition, gets ahead. So people who don't fit that type will often not I'll be seen as, well, they're not necessarily a good leader. They're not necessarily seen as leadership material. But, that is so wrong, because introverts do make great leaders too. And so that is one particular challenge. There's the challenge, and you sort of touched on as well, whereby acting in ways which go against who you are. And I see that happens a lot because there is that pressure to act more extroverted in the workplace. And what happens then is, people will do that, but that puts a lot of pressure on you when you're acting in ways that don't come naturally to you. You put yourself under a lot of pressure. It can be stressful, and it can ultimately affect your self-confidence.
Yeah. And also trust, I suppose, because people see that there's something not quite authentic.
That's right, yes. And you come across as inauthentic. And a great example that I like to use of this, and I will often, when I'm doing talks and workshops, I will often play the video. I don't know if you remember when Theresa May was Prime Minister and she did her last party conference. And she walked onto the stage, or she danced onto the stage to ABBA's Dancing Queen.
Yes. Yeah.
I cringed when I saw that because she just looked so inauthentic. And I thought, whoever's advised her to do that, no, it just made her come across as so inauthentic. And it was really cringe-worthy. And when I think the time when I saw her looking her most authentic self was when she was delivering her resignation speech outside 10 Downing Street, she just looked so natural and confident, and there was something about her, and I thought, why couldn't she have been like that throughout her premiership, rather than having these people, whoever it was, advising her to bounce onto the stage to ABBA's Dancing Queen, like, she's like these sort of like, yeah, me sort of thing.
Oh, that's such a powerful example. Yeah, because as you say, the stereotypes that we then fall into about, oh, actually, if I'm a good leader, this is the kind of behavior that I should be exhibiting. What are some of those other misconceptions or stereotypes that kind of exist about leaders, and particularly then for women leaders?
Yeah, so the misconceptions around don't make great leaders. They're not able to sort of have that influence and impact. That they lack confidence. They don't like public speaking. That they're shy. All those are just some of those misconceptions, and that can then determine how people see introverts. Like I said, mentioned it earlier, I would get told when I was a leader, "Oh, you should speak up more in meetings," and I'd think to myself, "Well, I'll speak when I've got something of value to add. I'm not going to speak just for the sake of speaking." And I think meetings are probably one of the biggest challenges in the workplace for introverted people, because the way that most meetings are conducted don't allow for that thinking and processing of information that people who are introverted need in order to give their best thoughts. Where people get put on the spot and they're expected to respond on the spot. The same thing is with interviews, job interviews. Again, it's the way that most interviews are conducted. You're just given a question and expected to respond on the spot. And then things like interviews and meetings then become a challenge, because introverted people feel, well, they have to perform and speak on the spot. And then that can bring on performance anxiety. And then they start to feel anxious about performing in meetings or performing in interviews, because they're not able to think and process their information. And that just sort of it's a sort of like a vicious circle, because then because they're anxious, they're not performing at their best.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It's just making me think there's an inherent bias, isn't there, built into the system, that means that in an interview, an extrovert is more likely to perform better if they're put on the spot, not because they're the better candidate, but it's set up for them to. And it's making me think my son was identified as dyslexic last year. And it's really opened my mind to kind of neurodivergence and how much is built into the system that doesn't allow for that divergence of thinking and style and preference. And it's, as you say, very much so in our kind of organizational environments.
And that's right. It doesn't, because there's this, what is considered the ideal, and people that don't meet that ideal are then not necessarily given that opportunity. Neurodiversity, that is, a thing that, many organizations don't necessarily think about how they can be inclusive in that way.
But this is a fundamental, the introversion, extroversion, and our awareness of it has been around for decades, if not longer, hasn't it? And the fact that we're still not set up for it. If somebody's listening going, yeah, I can completely relate to this. I'm an introverted woman and I'm having to navigate those kind of challenges in the workplace. What are some of the key strategies or techniques that an introverted woman can use to leverage their strength and really enhance their leadership presence?
So key, I would say, is developing self-awareness. Developing your self-awareness and knowing yourself, knowing your strengths, knowing the environments where you feel energized in and those that deplete your energy, and know how you can recharge. So, for example, don't have back-to-back meetings. A lot of leaders will have back-to-back meetings all day. If you're going into environments where there's all that stimulation going on around you, by the end of the day, you're going to feel drained, or even during the course of the day, you're going to feel like you want to withdraw and go inwards. And so then you're not necessarily going to be as engaged in the meeting. When it comes to speaking up in meetings and giving your opinion, if you get put on the spot and you find it challenging to be able to then give a quick response, do a lot of your thinking before the meeting. So go through the agenda beforehand, identify those topics that you want to express an opinion on, and think about what your thoughts are about that, make notes about it, so that when you go into the meeting, you've done a lot of that thinking beforehand. And if you do get put on the spot, you know, you're in your role for a reason, because you were deemed the best person for your role. So you have got, unless you're just starting out in the role, that you will have some knowledge and experience. So if you do get put on the spot, give your initial thoughts, what you initially think about what you're being asked. And then if you think that you may have something further to add, just let people know. If I've got anything further to add, I'll get back to you. If you get put on the spot and you find that you just can't think of anything in that moment, just say, well, once I've had a chance to process the information, I'll let you know what I think. And when I was researching my book, there was one senior vice president who said that when she joined the organization, she made it clear to people that if they wanted her to give a response or give her best thought, if they wanted her to make a decision on the spot, she could give her thoughts, but it wouldn't be her best. If they wanted her to give her best thoughts and make her best decisions, she needed time to process the information first. And I think by setting the scene in that way, that she set herself up well.
I love that. And it just creates a real authentic respect, doesn't it? I always remember Brené Brown. People probably be familiar with her. I know you will, Carol, but that she's an American lady, probably has one of the most well listened to TED Talks out there, talks a lot about vulnerability and leadership. And she does, she's so successful now. She does a lot of extroverted work. She's a public speaker. She goes in and does a lot of consulting with organizations, but is very open that she's introverted and really owns that well. So when she goes on stage, she'll do kind of long full day training sessions on stage, and she will say to people, right, we're going to be taking a 2-hour lunch. Now, that might be longer than you would normally have, but if you want me to come back and deliver my best, I'm an introvert and I need that time to recharge. And I've also heard her do it where she's like, and I'm flying back home to see my family tonight, and I want to make sure I've got enough energy at the end of today to give to my family. So this is what I need. And I just love how she owns, is that, as you say, self-awareness, speaking to your needs, owning it and creating the boundaries around it.
That's right, yes. And I love that. And I love when we see leaders, people in the public eye who are open in that way and talk about it in that way, because then it helps other people who may be feeling sort of drained, or feeling that they've got to put on this performance, that it's okay. It's okay to be you.
Absolutely. And for somebody that might be listening that's not introverted, but might have either knowingly or unknowingly people in their team or, in their workplace that are introverted, what perhaps tips or strategies or techniques could you give them to make sure that they're bringing and creating that time and space for the introverted people on their teams?
So giving them that space to have that time to think. So in meetings, when if you're sort of facilitating a meeting, chairing a meeting, make sure that everybody has an opportunity to contribute to the meeting. So it's quite easy just to let those who are more vocal have their say without necessarily listening to those who are not necessarily being as vocal, but making sure that everybody has an opportunity to contribute. There's one way which Amazon were reported, or I don't know whether they still do this, but when I was doing my research for my book, their senior leadership meetings, they would start, everybody had a briefing paper to read, they'd have 15 minutes to read it, get their thoughts on it, and then as a group, they would discuss the matters that they wanted to focus on in the meeting. Doing things like that enables people who need that time to process information to do so and process that information and speak and recognize that just because somebody is not as vocal doesn't mean to say that they've not got anything of value to add or that they aren't making a contribution.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, research shows that people who are extroverted get more opportunities in the workplace because their performance is more visible, because they're more likely to talk about what they're doing, they're more likely to self-promote than people who are introverted. So being aware of that and understanding that, and don't say to your introverted team members, you need to speak up more in meetings, or you need to be more, do this more. Get to understand them, what their strengths are, how they operate, and be aware of the unfavorable bias that there is towards introversion.
Love that. And it's making me think, I used to do a lot of work with the supermarket Asda up at their head office in Leeds, and they brought in a culture called the Thinking Environment, and it's by Nancy Klein.
Oh, yes, I love that.
And when you look at it, you're like, oh my God, why is this just not common practice? And I'll put a link in the show notes for people, but there are kind of these principles. I can't remember if there's 10 or 12 that are kind of like these principles that you hold any meeting by. And it's the quality of thinking in a meeting, and how do we create quality thinking, because that's how the decisions are made, and giving everybody that equal time and space and meeting different preferences. And the more I'm listening to you, the more I'm kind of going, oh, are there times when I'm just falling into the organizational bias? And it's being really aware of your own needs, but also other people's. And that's challenging when we live in such kind of fast-paced, demanding environments.
And that's right, yeah. And because of how our culture is and society is, that we've just become sort of conditioned that this is how it should be. But increasingly it is being challenged, and that is one of the things that I do, is to challenge and to create that awareness. And I think also with children, understanding with children, because that is where it starts, and I still see today where introverted children are made to feel that because they're more quieter, that they're not as good as the others. That then has an effect on them as they grow.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I've got my son, my eldest is highly extrovert. And I think that's where, when I first became a mum, I realized actually my more introversion, because I'd been able to build a life where I could have my introverted time. But then when I became a mum and I'd got this highly extroverted child, I was like, oh, okay, carving out that introversion time is going to be a real learning curve for me. But my daughter, I'm not sure if she's more introverted, but she's definitely more introverted than my son. But she came home from school the one day and said, oh, Mummy, I'm shy. And it's not a word we've ever used in our house, because it's not a word we use. You might be feeling, a bit self-conscious or whatever the word might be, but I've never ever labeled her shy, because and it was really interesting. I was like, oh, where have you got that from? And I even had a conversation with their teachers just in passing to say, do you use that word in the classroom? Because it wasn't a label I wanted put on her, because she's more reflective, or just needs more time, I'm very conscious of that with my children.
Yeah, and the thing is, and it's great that you you recognize that is what's gone on and what's happening. I was speaking to a woman a couple of years ago who'd got two children, one 7, one 5, a 7-year-old boy, extroverted, very outgoing. Family gatherings, he'd be running out around playing with the other children, and whereas a 5-year-old daughter would sort of cling to her or stick by her side, and she said that she would be pushing her to go and play, whereas she didn't want to. And she said one day she walked past the school and she saw her daughter sat in the playground on her own. And so she stormed down to the school, demanding, why is my child on her own? And the teacher said, well, she's happy. She's happy being on her own, and she's happy when she's playing with other children. And so I asked this woman, I said, what do you think the messages that your daughter's getting if you're constantly saying to her, oh, she's got to be like this, she's got to be like that. And she recognised, well, if she carries on like that, her daughter's going to believe in herself as she grows, because she's telling her that she's not good enough.
Yeah.
And then she realised that she needed to change.
And that comes from the best intention as parents, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. And that's one of the things that I see with a lot of the clients that I coach who experience imposter syndrome, or they lack self-belief because of situations where they've been made to feel that because they're introverted, because they're quiet, they're not good enough.
Yeah. So I think you touched on this earlier, but obviously part of being in an organizational environment and part of career progression is about networking and building these professional relationships. So what advice would you have for somebody that's introverted about how they can do that in a way that feels right for them without feeling like they've got to put an act on or feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, and it is important to develop your network. So if you're going to networking events, don't feel that you have to work the room and speak to lots of different people. Someone who's extroverted may enjoy doing that, but don't feel that you have to do that. People who are introverted prefer quality of conversations over quantity, generally. I don't want to stereotype, but generally, that's what the research has shown. And so it's okay to have fewer conversations that are more quality conversations with people when you're out networking. So things that you can do is, when you're networking, think about those people that you want to connect with. If you know who's going to be attending a networking event, maybe connecting with them on LinkedIn, or if it's an internal networking event, sending them an email to say, oh, I see you're going to be at such and such a place. It'd be good to have a chat, good to have a catch up. When you go to the networking event, be intentional about who you want to connect with, who you want to speak with, and play to your strengths, because introverts are well known for being good listeners and people like to be listened to. So utilize your strengths of listening when you're speaking to people. Listen to what they have to say. And if you're somebody who maybe finds it difficult to make a conversation when you're not networking, and this applies to people who are extroverted as well, because some people find it, don't know how to start conversations. Ask open questions that start what, where, who, when, so that the person will respond with more than a yes or a no answer. Listen to what they say, and then ask another question, open question, and do that a few times, and then the conversation will start to flow, and then they're likely to, because they feel heard, they feel listened, to ask you questions in return.
Yeah, I love that. And I hear what you're saying about really play to your strengths. And
yes, that's right.
And that's brilliant. And I'm what was also coming into my mind was and choose, I suppose, where possible, the methodologies that are more suitable. So I know, as I've got older, as I say, and I'm acknowledging and honouring my introversion more, when I meet up with friends, I'd rather do it in really small, intimate groups than do a big get together. Mm-hmm. And just, that meets my needs and I show up far better. And I'm wondering if that's the same in terms of networking, rather than go to these big conferences where you've got to work a room. It's, is there a networking group where you can sit down and have, perhaps 2, 3, 5, 10, whatever, might feel right for that person. So it doesn't feel as overwhelming.
That's right. Yes. And even maybe sort of meeting people on a one-to-one basis for coffee or something like that. I had a client who didn't like networking, introverted, didn't like networking, wanted to change career, wanted to progress. And I sort of encouraged her to utilize LinkedIn and reconnect with people on LinkedIn, and to reach out to people that she knew on LinkedIn. And what she did was she did that and arranged to meet people for coffees. And one person that she arranged to have a coffee with, it turned out that they were a non-executive director on the board of an organisation that she'd applied for a job for. And so that person was able to sort of go back and sing her praises, and she got the role on her merit, but it would have helped, that person being able to vouch for her.
Yeah. And several times we've mentioned already in this podcast about confidence. And I'm kind of, my head's going to two places in that there is this, as you say, this misconception that the quietness is mistaken for lack of confidence. And so I've got a question around that about how can we manage that? But also, if the message we're getting is that we're not good enough because we're not performing to this kind of extroverted bias, how we can manage that if it has impacted our confidence. I wonder if you could speak to those two pieces about any advice you've got.
Yeah. So with regards to the confidence, I'll do the latter part first. Because you've been made to feel that because you are quiet, that you're not good enough, is to challenge the thoughts and beliefs that you have about yourself. And because we're very much led by our emotions, most of us, or a lot of us are, and the way that we think affects how we feel, and we act and behave according to how we're feeling. So if you've been given these messages and it has shaped how you think and what you believe about yourself, just challenge it, and look at what is a more helpful thought to have about yourself, what is a more helpful perspective to have about yourself. Recognize that there is this bias, and people who have told you that you're, or made you feel that you're not good enough because you're quiet, they're probably just acting on how they've been conditioned, or what they've been conditioned to think and believe. So challenge those thoughts and beliefs that you have about yourself, and look at the skills and the experience and your strengths and what it is that you bring to the table, and don't mistake a lack of competence for a lack of confidence. So if it's a case of, well, because oftentimes I see people will write themselves off saying, oh, I lack confidence, when there may be just one particular skill that they need to develop, or it might be that they need to get experience in a particular thing that they haven't got experience in. So don't just write yourself off, but look at, if you're saying you lack confidence, what is it that you actually lack confidence in? Identifying what it is that you lack confidence in, and look at, well, what is needed to bring yourself to speed. Is it developing skills? Is it getting some experience? Or is it practicing something? Because with practice comes confidence. So is it that you lack confidence? Is it that you need to develop your confidence? Or is it that you lack the belief in yourself? So once you are able to identify which it is, then you can address it more easily, rather than just a blanket, I lack confidence.
Brilliant. And I think that's so powerful. It's making me think of a client that I've been coaching for a while, and she's a finance director for quite a large organization. And she had her kind of annual kind of performance discussion with her boss, who's the CFO. And in this conversation, they were talking about career progression, and she was saying, she does want to progress in her career, and the succession plan would be that she would have that CFO role. And his feedback was, well, you're not in the running for it because you're not challenging enough. And this was a really difficult piece of feedback for her, because it came from the board of directors are incredibly challenging. They're all men. They're quite aggressive challengers, and she didn't fit that stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
And she went away and reflected on it, and we had a coaching session on it. And she kind of went back and was like, I've got to disagree with that. I do challenge, but let me show you how I challenge. And she put it across in like, this is how you'll see me challenge. Here's some really great examples of when I've done it. It might not fit your stereotype, but I'm absolutely doing it. And here's the impact that it's had. And she recognized that perhaps she's not being visible enough in how she challenges. And her thing was, not taking that on board as, she can't challenge. It's just, no, I can. I do it in my own way. And I need to be sharing more about when I do it, because you may not be seeing me do it, because I do it in more of a quieter way.
Yeah.
And And her feedback also was, you know what, if we're a company that's committed to diversity and inclusion. If you all want me to just be another kind of the same as the rest of the people on the board, we're not going to have diversity in thinking. We're not going to have diversity in approach. And, I bring something different. And it, like, her self-respect and her self-esteem in having those conversations just was amazing to.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. And good for her, because you don't have to be loud and batty about it, but you do need to, people do need to know about your achievements and the difference that you're making. And I think that's often where introverted women leaders maybe sell themselves short, because they don't necessarily talk about it to who the people that need to know particularly. So, like I think your client is a great example of how it can be done and how to have that conversation. And that is quite a difficult conversation to have when you've been given that feedback.
And it stung. The feedback really stung when she first got it, and so it took some processing to get to that place.
Yeah, and particularly by a board which is mainly or all male, in that sort of environment where you're just standing up as yourself, being your authentic self, and if you're saying, no, I'm not having this. And so I really take my hat off for her for just being herself and for speaking up in that way.
Yeah. And I'm intrigued about kind of some of your practices, because clearly you've done more reflection than probably most people will have on yourself because of the work you do. What have you learnt about kind of preserving your energy and what works for you in how you work? We talked earlier about, making sure you don't have back-to-back meetings. Are there any things that you've learned along your journey that kind of might seem just everyday practice to you, but somebody might go, oh my God, I've never thought of that?
Yeah, so having that space for thinking and reflecting. One of the things that I do most days is journal. And that is a great way for me just to self-reflect and to think about, what is going on in my mind and process my thoughts and so forth. So that is one thing that I do. Having that space, where I can be on my own and being okay with it. And being, having those boundaries in place and not being afraid to say, that, I want some time on my own, or turning down invitations if I feel that I haven't got the energy to go to something.
And that's huge. That oh my gosh, that's such a huge one, because I think there is so much pressure, particularly I imagine when you're running your own business as well, because networking and connection and not wanting to miss out on opportunities, and but just honoring yourself and going, no, that's not going to work for me.
Yeah. Yeah, because that was one of the things that I did, when I first started my business, and I was networking here, networking there, and it got to this stage. I thought, oh gosh, this is draining, and so then became very selective about the networking events that I went to or that I do go to. I don't just like going to a networking event where it's just like a social gathering, and I like to go to somewhere where there's a theme, maybe a speaker or something that there's that focus, not just a gathering where there's just talk, and drinks and talk and blah, 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 blah. I mean, I do go to the odd ones, but I'm selective about where I go networking, because I know what drains me and what energizes me.
Yeah. It's interesting. It was my daughter's 5th birthday this weekend, so we had family over on Sunday, and then she had a party for her school friends at a soft play last night. And I got home and I was like, oh my God, I'm so tired, because I'd had 2 back-to-back days of a lot of people. And it was interesting because I was saying to one of the mums, I was like, having a party at soft play is kind of my idea of hell, because the stimulation is off the scale for me. And it's interesting because I've had to tolerate almost the guilt of saying that as a mum, because some of the mums are like, oh no, I love it here. The kids get to play. I get to sit down and have a cup of coffee. It's like I feel like they're looking at me going, oh, you're not a very good mom if you can't cope with that. And it's, just tolerating that. That's just me. I've just got to accept, I'd rather my daughter, and as she gets older, hopefully, and I'm not trying not to influence this too much, she'll choose 2 or 3 friends that we take out and do something with rather than the whole class. And, and just, again, acknowledging that and not making it wrong.
That's right. Yes. I think it's about allowing a child just to be themselves. And I could totally relate to what you said earlier about your extroverted son, because I've got a son who's very extroverted. And as a child, he was draining. And first thing in the morning, he'd be yap, 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 and wanting to play, whereas I want just to be a little bit of quiet as I start my day and get into the day. So yes, I could totally relate to what you said about that.
Yeah, and I again, once I acknowledged it, I found bath times really difficult because I'd almost drained all my energy being around him as an extrovert, to the point that we could be sat next to each other, but if we weren't in conversation, he'd go, "Mum, Mum," and I'd be like, "Yeah," and he's like, "Nothing, just want to check you there." He constantly wanted to be connected. And I had to kind of say to my husband, I need you to take over bath times, because I'm literally energetically, I'm on the floor, not necessarily physically, just that mental. I've not got the capacity to hold this without kind of getting irritable. And that's not fair on him. And just honouring, that's what I need. And he needs somebody that can connect and's got the energy for that.
Yeah. And that brings to mind something with regards to sort of introverted leaders who are managing extroverted team members, about recognizing that they may have a different kind of energy, or act in a way which may not necessarily be you may find draining, or if it's about having that awareness. And I once had a client who had an extroverted team member who would be talking about what she was doing to my client's manager. And initially my client saw it as, well, this person is like trying to like bypass her and get the attention of her manager. But when we really explored it, what it was is this, because this person, she wanted to progress. She was extroverted, and that was her style, to be talking about what she's doing, and she spoke to everybody. And once my client had that understanding of her team member, she was then able to give her the opportunities that enabled her to be out there, to speak a lot and to interact a lot. And that really helped their relationship as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's holding the curiosity about, what else could be going on here, and then you can then be, I suppose, a bit more compassionate to it. Oh, there's so much you've shared and so much goodness in this conversation. But if there is just one thing you'd want somebody listening to take away from this conversation, what would you want that to be?
I'd say be introvert and proud.
Yeah.
Be yourself. Don't feel that you've got to put on a persona and act in ways that are not you. Be yourself. You utilize your strengths. Develop your self-awareness. Sorry, this is more than one thing. Develop your self-awareness, so those situations where you may need to modify your behavior, but it's about modifying your behavior in ways which are authentic. And all leaders need to be able to modify their behavior depending on the situation and the outcome that they want to have. So whether you are introverted, ambiverted, extroverted, having that self-awareness about so there may be situations where you might not necessarily feel like going somewhere, but because of the role, because of something that is needed, you may need to. So it's about knowing yourself, understanding yourself, and being introvert and proud.
Brilliant. Thank you. So where can people find out more about you, Carol, your work, your book? Where would you point them towards? And I can put all the links in the show notes.
If you go to my website, aboundingsolutions.com, you can find out more about me. The link to my book is on there as well. And I'm on LinkedIn, Carol Stewart on LinkedIn. Connect to me on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing all of your insights. There's so much goodness in this conversation.
Thank you, Nikki. It's been a pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too, so if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.